a possibility as well. Now, my only point is,
on that. So I think we can say maybe this is happening, but actually that doesn't really sort of play out as to why people aren't entering nursing college. We can't say that it's not like we have a surfeit of trained nurses sat around in the UK desperately looking for jobs, but they can't get a job because there's not enough place out there. It's the opposite way. We have a surfeit of spaces. We have a shortage of staff here, and we just don't have enough people going into nursing college to do it.
I'm sure this is a problem that could be solved without recourse to immigrants from people who do not necessarily speak very good English or who have different notions of what society should look like. I think this is an easily solved problem. And the idea that the Windrush generation, what was it, just several tens of thousands, those people single-handedly saved the NHS is really quite preposterous.
It's also anyway, to say that I was saying they were single-handedly doing it. But I'll just come back to the other point that you made, which again is a really useful one, is you talk about the Muslim grooming gang. And obviously, nobody is going to condone or do anything other than condemn a group of religiously affiliated people getting together to perpetrate paedophilia. But what's I think is fascinating is that it was a Muslim gang is a break from British tradition, because we've had a long-standing tradition in Britain and certainly in Ireland as well of paedophilia, religiously affiliated paedophilia being carried out by the church. So it's interesting that a lot of coverage gets made of Muslim-related paedophilia, and quite rightly, but the people then look the other way. We don't have Tommy Robinson, for example, who's protesting outside of mosques, protesting outside of trials of Muslim grooming gangs, and then a couple of weeks later, when yet more scandals come out about the Catholic Church and their institutionalized paedophilia, we don't have someone like Tommy Robinson going and standing outside of a church and saying, I'm against religiously affiliated paedophilia. It's funny how he's against the ones that are just not British traditional religion.
It's because, isn't it obvious to you why he distinguishes between the two? One is an utterly unnecessary imported problem. The other is a problem that is deeply rooted in a tradition and a church that has been in Britain for a long time. Obviously, those problems should be corrected and rooted out. Why import brand new problems that could have been avoided entirely? That is why he is so annoyed about this. Let us not forget also that when these things were cropping up, there were many people involved in social services who deliberately looked the other way because they were afraid of being accused of racism. If they pointed out that the perpetrators were overwhelmingly of one group and that they were they were exploiting native girls who were all white. This is an absolutely shameful thing that would be unthinkable in a healthy society. And this kind of self-reproach, this inability to see the truth and to speak out about the truth, is part of the same suicidal mentality that is resulting in this kind of replacement of white majority populations by aliens, many of whom have no desire to integrate and who only look upon their host societies as a source of exploitation.
So one of the things you say there about the changing of the majority, and when we talk about, you're saying whites an awful lot, and you talk about the identity of whites. I've seen your videos as well saying that whites have a clear racial identity. I'm quite interested by that, because do white people have a very clear racial identity? And you talk too about white culture, and that there is such a thing as white culture. What do you mean when you say white culture?
First of all, a racial identity. White people used to have a far more vivid sense of solidarity and identity. This has in many cases been beaten out of them by, in the United States, people who emphasize slavery, who emphasize lynching, all of the ructions that have been throughout American history because of this attempt to build a society in which two very different races, whites and blacks, have tried to live together. There was a time when whites had a clear sense that the United States was to be a majority white country forever. The very first immigration law passed by the very first Congress of the United States in 1790. This is just after the Constitution had been ratified and the representatives of the people are getting together to decide what kind of country they're going to have. They passed a naturalization law that limited naturalization to free white people of good character. This should have been something that was written into the Constitution, but it was taken for granted that the United States was to be a white extension of Europe, not some sort of multi-culti mishmash that's up for grabs for the rest of the world. This has been something that has been taken for granted in the United States up until maybe 50, 60, 70 years ago. So what we are seeing now is very much a change. And it's a change that can be traced to a whole bunch of different factors, but this is in effect a denial of the original and traditional view of the United States. Until 1965, we had an immigration policy that was designed specifically to keep the country majority white. That was the change that I described earlier that took place in 1965 and was advertised as something that was strictly a cosmetic measure that would not change the country. White people did not want to become a minority, and in my view, not wanting to become a minority is normal, natural, and healthy. And after this process began, people started talking about, well, diversity is a great thing. We never thought so in the past, but now we're going to make a virtue of a necessity and spin all sorts of silly fantasies about how we're far better in a country in which, in fact, Mexicans and blacks get into riots against each other, blacks and Asians don't get along. Somehow we're supposed to describe this as some sort of wonderful improvement on what was otherwise a coherent and healthy majority white country.
So in that sense, it's very interesting that you say that one of the problems in America is that you have, as you put it, black people and Hispanic people not getting along, black people and Asian people not getting along, and you're also kind of at the same time talking about a world in which you don't think white people and black people ought to live side by side. So you're in separating out white people in there. It seems like it's a strange vision of a healthy society to say it's a good thing to have people not getting on with each other, and we shouldn't strive to try and have people living side by side in kind of unity. It seems odd to say that it's important to keep these lines as hard as possible. I mean, you say that America has attempted to live together, and it's not as good as it, and that's been hard since the early days when America in 1790 said that free white people. Now, one of the reasons that they were talking about free white people at the time is because they didn't consider black people to be full people. They didn't consider them to be as evolved, as advanced, and even as sophisticated a species as white people. And that's an understanding that we've come to recognize was inherently flawed.
No. The point is they wanted them all to be white. They recognized that, to the extent that they thought about it, they recognized that Asians had sophisticated societies of their own, and that's fine. But they wanted to remain majority white. And what my point is, there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. There is no example of a multiracial nation in which you do not find racial friction, racial conflict. And artificially bringing people together when they are not likely to get along is a very foolish mistake. That is the mistake that we made very early on, and that is the mistake that Europe is imitating, much to its dismay, and much to this enormous industry that has cropped up to try to produce this illusion that somehow it is a good thing, despite all of the costs accompanied with it. I would say that what's happening in Viktor Orban's Hungary, in Poland today, in the Baltic Republics, they refuse to accept this kind of change in their population. And they look at what happens in Germany or France, where now there are occasions where Christmas markets are being canceled or heavily fortified for fear of Muslim attack. They don't have that problem in Poland. They don't have that problem in Hungary. And they don't want to have that problem. And why should they want to have that problem? This is going to be a real demarcation line in the future of Europe. Those countries that have this silly idea that let them all in is going to produce some sort of happy kumbaya world in which we all hold hands and sing songs together. And those societies that realize that if there is cultural, racial, religious homogeneity, that leads to a society that is healthier and one that's more likely to be peaceful, successful, one in which people trust each other, and where ultimately they will be happier.
But if you are promoting an idea that America, for example, should be majority white or white only, as other people have put it, it's very It seems an odd thing to say, well, once we have a white-only America, things will be absolutely fine. I mean, you don't have to go back too far in America to see signs saying no dogs, no Irish. Now, unless you were to say that white people from Ireland are a different type of white person, then, you know, that there is a distinction between a white British person and a white Irish person, for example. It'd be very hard to argue that wasn't a racist or it wasn't a xenophobic element of America. So even by going to a white-only society, you're going to have these issues, unless you were to say that Irish people aren't equal as well.
I see you love to trot out these new lefty swear words to describe ancient human feelings. The British, the English, had a deep contempt for the Irish. Would you call that racist or xenophobic? No, there was this ethnic conflict that goes back centuries, having to do with different power relationships, different religion. All of these things are part of human nature. I would never deny that white people have had very serious conflicts among themselves. However, white people, because they have similar biological and cultural origins, are much more likely to iron out those conflicts when compared to people who have different biological origins.
Where's the evidence
people,
of that?
No. Well, okay, let me give you the evidence of that. There have been many, many people who say, well, look, when the Irish, when the Italians, when the Hungarians showed up, in the early 1900s in the United States, there was prejudice, there was friction, there were conflicts. Now, we got over those conflicts, and we're going to do absolutely the same with the Haitians and the Guatemalans and the Vietnamese who are coming now. This is a very stupid analogy. Because at the time when the European ethnics were coming to the United States, we already had two other groups that had been here far longer than the European ethnics and who still have not assimilated. What are those two groups? Blacks and American Indians. Why have they not assimilated the way the Irish and the Italians did? For the reasons that I've just described. Biology, culture, all of those things that are summed up in the fact that we have been evolving as a species in divergent ways for at least 100,000, perhaps 200,000 years. When you have Europeans, they can assimilate and produce a melting pot. When you have groups that are not from Europe, it is infinitely more difficult. And that is why the analogy of Tierra del Fuegians, for example, or Turks or whoever they are, assimilating just the way the Italians did is false.
But so that I think it's very interesting then that you say that the two groups that were already in America when European settlers arrived or when European immigrants arrived in the last kind of century, who haven't assimilated are black people and Native Americans. It's interesting that you point those two groups out and you put that down to biology, but it's interesting that those two groups were also the groups that were systematically prejudiced against by, first of all, with Native Americans, the European settlers who colonized and ethnically cleansed in many ways the country of America when they first arrived, and black people who were brought over not to be citizens and inhabitants, but to be servants and property. So for those two groups that were already in America, the reasons of their being in America and their role in the white majority America was very much as servile, and in fact white majority America didn't accept either black people or Native Americans as being of the same species, of the same
look. No one ever pretended that blacks or American Indians were not human beings. Don't be silly about that. The idea
you genuinely
that they were
don't think they ever called them savages who were not capable of the same level of sophistication as white men. You don't think that ever came up in history?
No one ever said that they were, well, you could probably find some, I don't know, some sort of 16th century Portuguese who first encountered Africans and thought that they were not human beings. But the idea that antebellum Southerners did not consider black slaves human beings, they made sure they tried to make them Christian. In some cases, they taught them to read. The idea that they didn't consider them human is just silly.
But to teach them, so it's interesting you say that too, that they taught them to be Christian and taught them to read. But in both those instances, those weren't acts of compassion and philanthropy, but acts of ownership and improvement, in the sense that if you have someone who is a slave to you and they can read, they're a much more useful tool than someone who is illiterate and can't be used in that way. So unless you're arguing that it's philanthropy that those was reached.
Look, we're not talking about philanthropy at all. We're talking about your silly idea that antebellum Southerners didn't think blacks were human. That's the only thing I'm talking about here. Now, as far as the legitimacy of wanting to maintain one's own tribal group as the majority,